So just before we begin, could I ask you, first of all, welcome, but also could I ask you to put your microphones on mute, and please, if you could disable your webcam. And I think we'll start. We're just going to start now, but this will enable bandwidth for this event. Thank you for doing that. So on behalf of everyone at the Centre for Climate Justice, a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us for this, the second of our online public engagements. Our public engagement events are aimed at not just academics, but practitioners and students and anyone who's interested in the topics that we have online to present. So for this occasion, we have participants from many parts of the world. So wherever you're coming from, a good morning or a good afternoon, and certainly a good evening, and a huge warm welcome to you all. For those of you who don't know me, I am Tassim Jaffrey, and I am the Director of the Centre for Climate Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University. And our focus is putting front and centre difficult and challenging conversations and research on the impacts of climate change from an injustice perspective. We provide education on climate justice via our unique master's programme on climate justice, and we are home to a growing number of climate justice doctoral students. So again, a huge welcome to you all, and it's a huge pleasure to be able to be welcoming you to this event today. So on to our event today, we will be on local resistance to climate change adaptation, lessons for the development sector. So we will be joined by two wonderful speakers today, Dr. Mikulewicz, who is a research fellow at the Centre for Climate Justice. And Michael is a political and development geographer by training, and uses his research and his concepts to look into areas such as climate justice, but in terms of resilience, adaptation and vulnerability. And he's really keen on investigating the politics of human responses to climate change, with a particular focus on sub-Saharan Africa. We will also be joined by Krysentia Podgórska, and Krysentia is a doctoral researcher at Loughborough University, and she studies the compound hazards of deadly human heat events following tropical cyclones. And she has a particular focus on climate hazard probability analysis and the combined potential risk of these hazards. And her particular research interests include disaster justice and adaptive capacity, but also vulnerability. But I'd also like to say that Kreska is also a graduate of ours from Glasgow Caledonian, where she completed her master's degree in climate justice last year. So, first of all, Michael will be presenting major findings of a research project that was funded by the Carnegie Trust Research Incentive Grant, titled Investigating Local Resistance to Adaptation with Reference to Climate Injustice in São Tomé and Príncipe. The work was conducted in 2019 in Baleia village, which is in South São Tomé and Príncipe. So this will be followed by a presentation by Kreska, who worked with Michael on the project, and she'll be presenting an in-depth analysis on the gender aspects. So the format of today's event will be these two presentations, and this will be followed by a question and answer session. So if you would like to ask a question to either of our speakers, could you please provide it in the chat box, which is the purple thumbnail you can see in the bottom of your screens on the right hand side. Senan Matar, I think you're there somewhere. If you can make yourself known, who works with me at the Centre for Climate Justice. Senan and I will be fielding questions, and we will take two questions at a time. So again, without any further ado, again, a huge welcome to you all for joining us for this really exciting conversation ahead. So Michael, I would like to hand over to you as our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Tassine. Can everybody hear me okay? Just want to check before I start. Can you hear me? Yes, great. Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, that's what I wanted. Yeah, great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much, Tassine, for the introduction. My name is Mikulewicz, and I'm going to present the key findings and recommendations of this project. I'm going to, in this presentation, I'm going to provide you with a brief study context, and then discuss a little bit about what we already know about resistance to development. Based on previous studies. I'm going to go over the methods and study settings, and then describe what happened and what the effects of what happened were. And then the major part of the conversation or of the presentation will be on the causes of the resistance that actually took place, both in terms of internal and external factors. And I'm going to conclude by providing some final thoughts and recommendations, most importantly, for the development sector that the research team came up with. Okay, so just to let you know where we are coming from with this study, we've got the observation that is widely recognized that vulnerability of economies and communities dependent on natural resources is quite high. But at the same time, we've got growing availability of financial resources for adaptation, for example, through the Green Climate Fund. And you can see this OECD graph that shows that adaptation finance actually is increasing every year. Obviously, we don't know what COVID-19 will have, what kind of impacts COVID-19 will have on this, but this is what has been happening over the last years. However, we also know that some adaptation projects often fail to decrease local vulnerability, and moreover that sometimes they can be opposed by people who are supposed to receive assistance in adapting to climate change impacts. So why is that? Well, critical scholars like myself, we've been saying for a few good years now that adaptation is a contested and inequitable process. It's not a straightforward or an easy policy goal to pursue. And it's very complicated and convoluted at the local level specifically. So this is the framing, I guess, or where we're coming from when we are conceptualizing this research. So what do we know already about local resistance to development? Well, we actually, as it happens, we know quite a lot because history has shown us a lot of instances where local people decided to oppose development as understood by outside actors, whether it was during the Narmada Dam protests in India, the Cochabamba water war in Bolivia, the La Via Campesina food sovereignty protests throughout Latin America, or the African independence movement in the 60s and 70s. So we actually know quite a bit about local resistance to development itself. But what is resistance? So I followed James Scott's definition of resistance as any act by members of a subordinate class intended to mitigate or deny claims made on that class by superordinate classes in order to advance its own claims vis-a-vis those superordinate classes. So this is this definition assumes that resistance can be individual, it can be collective, it can be material, it can be discursive. It's very broad. And to go a little bit deeper into resistance in terms of development, Cindy Katz in 2004 in her book Growing Up Local identified 3 different kinds of opposition to development. The first one was resilience. So she described that as yet other ways to get by each day. So essentially responding to the current pressures on your livelihood in a way that allow you to get by each day. And then reworking is a step up from that, where actually the oppressed groups try to redirect the resources in their favor, working with the current system, but not necessarily trying to change it. And finally, and that is my focus here, we've got resistance, which, as Cindy Katz argues, requires an oppositional consciousness. So the awareness that those conditions of exploitation and oppression have to be redressed, and active or that action has to be taken by those oppressed. And as I will demonstrate, people in Ponta Baleia, the village that I visited as part of fieldwork, the residents definitely have that kind of oppositional consciousness for redressing those inequalities. So that actually got me thinking. We know a lot about the local resistance to development historically, but what is different about adaptation? So that is a question I kind of asked myself. Is there anything different about it? And that brings me to the mainstream approach to how adaptation is pursued in low and middle income countries. And that approach is marked by what I would call, and how many scholars have called, technomanagerialism, which means that climate change becomes an environmental problem. It's a non-political problem. It's a problem that requires technical and technological solutions provided by experts. That also leads to top-down approaches to development, and to adaptation. So on the left, you've got a concept picture of inflatable sea barriers for New York State, for example. So that's the kind of that's an example of a technological solution to sea level rise in this case. But what we argue at the Center for Climate Justice is a different approach, an approach that actually shows that climate change is a socio-political issue. And as such, adaptation also needs to be looking at the social inequalities that mediate people's everyday lives. And that also, by definition, advocates for a co-productive or a bottom-up approach to planning adaptation solutions. So we've got two very different approaches here that I would say this project demonstrates that to be clashing locally. So in terms of our methods and the study setting, how do we go about doing this research? The first idea came in 2016, building on anecdotal information and data that I collected during my doctoral fieldwork for a different project in São Tomé Príncipe. But then, as part of this grant by the Carnegie Trust, I was able to go back to São Tomé in February and March 2019 for 10 days and conduct semi-structured interviews with community members, UNDP staff, government, and civil society representatives. And in addition to that, I also conducted two focus groups, one with men and one with women at the community level. So in terms of São Tomé and Príncipe, it's a small island nation, a small island developing state to be precise, and an least developed country. That's what these acronyms stand for. It's very dependent on foreign aid. At the moment, about 95% of the state budget comes directly from outside donors. It's a very small country by population and by area. It's only about 210,000 people. It's a former Portuguese colony. It's considered very vulnerable to climate impacts. So we're talking about droughts, floods, sea level rise, diseases, pests, and so forth. And these impacts are spread unevenly across the island because there's a lot of microclimates because of the high relief throughout the island. So there's a lot of different impacts that we can talk about here. And importantly, from the perspective of climate justice at the global level, São Tomé is a carbon sink country, which means that it absorbs more more carbon dioxide than it actually emits, and largely that's done through its tropical forests, because the island is the island here in the south, Ilha das Rolas, is located exactly on the equator. So, in order to address these vulnerabilities that I just mentioned, the government partnered with UNDP on what is commonly referred to there as the Adaptation project. And the objective of that project to strengthen the resilience of rural community livelihood options against climate change. So in many ways, it was an agricultural development initiative aimed at increasing farmers' incomes so that they can build their resilience to climate change. And so this is the country. I'm going to now talk about Ponta Baleia, so the village that is the focus of this study, which is located in the district of Cauê in the south there. So in terms of the community itself, there's about 150 to 200 residents. As I mentioned, it's located in the Kawe district. The district of Kawe is the most remote and most sparsely populated in the whole country. In terms of local livelihoods, local people rely on farming, fishing, animal husbandry, small trade, agricultural labor. For example, there's a huge palm oil plantation very close to the village where a lot of local residents actually work. And it's owned by a French / Luxembourg corporation and producing palm oil. And in terms of local development challenges, we're talking here about a very, very poor state of local housing, no electricity, no treated water, no sanitation facilities, some issues with food security, although that's not as bad as in certain other parts of the region. Education, transport, and public health issues also, specifically the road to the village, as I will shortly demonstrate, is in a very poor state. In terms of the local climate impacts, the residents have complained about flash floods and landslides because the community actually is located on a slope close to the coast. And because there's no drainage in the village, there's the increased frequency of waterborne diseases following flash floods and heavy rain. So what happened? So what is this entire project about? Why are we talking about Ponta Baleia? In many ways, the development challenges and the background of the village is very similar to other localities in São Tomé Príncipe or in West Africa in general. So what makes Ponta Baleia special? So in 2015, September 2015, the project staff conducted rapid participatory appraisals in the village. And the result of that was a division of the data that was collected into community problems and climate change problems by the project staff. And you can see examples here. So what's important here is that the staff somewhat arbitrarily decided that some problems are more social and some are more related to climate change. And importantly, the project would only address the latter. So the project would only address these issues raised here. As you can see, highly degraded houses or an infrastructure, lack of electricity, lack of drainage channels, and so forth, were considered social problems and therefore outside of the remit of the adaptation project. So following these appraisals, there was another event in early 2016, a consultation event on building resilience at the community level. And this is when the project staff offered the solutions that they believed would benefit Ponta Baleia. And these solutions were the construction of a drainage system, and more importantly, the construction of a few pigsties for the community because of the perceived public health concerns related to free-roaming livestock. However, the immediate feedback from the community was that, and I quote, "In this place, putting animals in enclosures is not an option. There is no one to guard them or feed them." So in the end, the residents openly rejected that form of assistance. In the meantime, the drainage system fell off the agenda, and the attention was focused on the pigsty issue. And UNDP was entirely unprepared for this kind of opposition. So it referred to the local authority, the Câmara Distrital de Cauê, to mediate it, but that was unsuccessful. And I say mediate with a reservation because it was a mediation between national institutions and in the project and the local authority. Unfortunately, representatives of the local community were not invited. So in general, there are two main issues around this conflict. The issue of the availability of feed for animals, their safety, because arguably when you put animals in enclosures, it's easier to find them and to steal them, and the suitability of the breeds that would be provided. But more importantly, the real priority of the community has been for a long time the very, very poor state of the local housing. So that led to feedback like this. They just take our names, but they never do anything. It's always the same question and nothing is changing. Names taken, nothing done. Nobody trusts in it anymore. So when I took this to the former president of the Kawe district to talk to him about this issue, he explained it in this way. When faced with situations of lack of attention to their priorities, it causes a rupture, manifesting in the most diverse ways. And this refusal of Ponta Baleia is one of the ways in which this discontent is manifested. So what was the effect of that resistance in the end? Actually, in the first stage, the project, because of that resistance, the project ended up omitting the village entirely and focused on the other 29 villages in the meantime for the first couple of years. The project was supposed to run for 4 years. So in the second stage, rather than constructing pigsties, the project provided a solar freezer for the local fish sellers who are all women. And that's something that Kreska will be talking about during her presentation. And when I asked practitioners whether or not there will be any long-term implications for Ponta Baleia for that resistance, they were actually divided. They weren't sure if the community will gain a reputation of being difficult to work with, or whether it will not have a bearing on future development assistance. So that's very hard to gauge at the moment. So given that background, given what happened, we were focusing our analysis on the causes, dynamics, and effects of that resistance, the degree of success or failure, and most importantly, ways to ensure that visibility, the political equality and subjectivity of local residents could be foregrounded in order to make more equitable and effective adaptation choices and outcomes. So we wanted to delve into the reasons why Ponta Baleans actually said no to UNDP, and you know, the United Nations agencies seldom encountered that kind of opposition to development aid. So saying that pigsties were just not the priority of the village was not sufficient explanation, and we wanted to kind of unpack that conflict a little bit more. And we came up with a list of different internal and external factors that I'm going to go over right now. First of all, we've got community isolation. As you can see on the satellite image here, Ponta Baleia is relatively secluded, and historically has been relative to nearby villages of Vila Malanza and Porto Alegre, which are both larger. The main road, the national road number 2, bypasses the community. So you can see here that you know, the community actually is located about 300 yards from the main road, and that stretch of 300 yards is in a very poor condition, and only a few specific vehicles, 4x4s, for example, can make it there. And it's kind of deceptive on the image; it's not visible, but where that perforated line is, there's actually an escarpment there. So you can't actually access the road from that side. So the community is kind of bypassed by the main road, and that leads Ponta Baleans to believe that, you know, in the end they're not treated equally. And a lot of development assistance goes to Vila Malanza and Porto Alegre because they are actually located on the main road. For example, they both received generators because that part of the district is not connected to the national electricity grid. Unfortunately, Ponta Baleia did not benefit assistance. So we've got, you know, feedback like the projects they don't come here normally. Sometimes they pass through on the way to Porto Alegre. It's very difficult here. Another internal factor that we've noticed was people's previous experience with development projects, and that might be related to equipment that wasn't working properly. So the freezer that was delivered, that's something Kreska will talk about in greater detail. Selective participation in projects. There were reports of, you know, projects arriving in the village and talking to very specific people rather than with the entire community, which kind of increased the level of distrust. Then addressing non-priority needs, so like the pigsties that I mentioned, but also there was a project, an EU project that offered the establishment of a community radio, which the residents were taken completely by surprise with, because they did not see that as a major development priority for them. Very importantly, there's plenty of promises that have been made on the part of the development sector that never materialized. For example, the Embassy of Portugal promised to build a computer/TV room in the village. Unfortunately, that never happened. As one of the women said, all the children were happy because the man talked to us and gave us guarantees to put in television and other things. And up until now, nothing. And then she did this and said, when someone says they will do something, they must do it. But when they go away, they forget. So related to this issue of broken promises and other experience with development, we noted a deep sense of resignation and abandonment among the local residents, leading to statements like, "We are abandoned here, living like homeless people." So projects and consultations are seen by Ponta Baleans are irresponsive, unproductive, and essentially a waste of time. And they sometimes express that in very blunt and blatant terms. "We don't care about UNDP. They don't help. Hell, I have nothing to tell them, and I don't give a damn about them." And that's not something you hear very, very often about major development players locally. So that led us to I'm just going to leave the question here. Was it the community that rejected adaptation and development, or was it the other way around, where development did not see the potential to collaborate co-productively with the community on its challenges? And a final internal factor that we observed, we identified, and a very, very, very important one, is the existence of the Porto Alegre community group. So that's an inclusive bi-monthly assembly. So anybody from the local from that part of the district can actually attend and exchange ideas, submit grievances. It's just a way for people to communicate and collaborate and coordinate their activities. The group was organized by Leigos para o Desenvolvimento because so that's an NGO that places volunteers. It's a faith-based NGO that places volunteers for 6-month terms. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, and they've been doing this since 2012. So that community group has been in place for over 8 years now. And importantly, the group prepares a development roadmap for the region every year in a very inclusive manner. So according to one of the NGO practitioners, development practitioners present in the district, Ponta Baleans who regularly participate in these meetings were vaccinated against a top-down rapport with development agents. They want to have a bottom-up approach, and if there is a top-down approach, they will block it. And so these were the internal factors that we noticed, but there's also external ones that we thought kind of had a bearing on this whole situation. And first, we've got a very general observation on international development aid structure. Project-based approaches to development, which is currently the dominating approach, are seen as limited and ineffective, and that's in the view of the vast majority of development practitioners on the island. Moreover, there was talk about very rigid project design, specifically the inability of the adaptation project to change its focus from constructing pigsties to diverting some of the funds towards renovating local houses, for example, or other issues that were more salient for local people. There was also a very complex relationship between the partners of the project themselves. I'm going to go into that shortly. But going back to the projects, one of the NGO practitioners said, "We are a project-fed country. We are fed by projects. We live from it. So we need to be more prepared to work in a project framework, or we need to change the project framework altogether, which is something impossible." So you can see how entrenched that project-based approach is. And practitioners themselves don't believe it's possible to change it, which I personally disagree with. With regards to this specific project and its design, the focus on climate resilience and climate change rather than broader social vulnerabilities was what caused the rift with aid recipients in the first place. So one of the project staff members said, "We saw adaptation as a priority. Ergo, the project will focus on sanitation in Ponta Baleia," which should have been a red flag from the beginning, but unfortunately it wasn't. And that's because the participation model lacked meaningful deliberation. There were only a few meetings over 3 years with the community. We actually had to remind some residents who we talked with what UNDP was and what the adaptation project was, because they didn't have any recollection of it. And combined with that is the low institutional capacity within the project at national institutions and UNDP itself to actually facilitate participatory development and ensure project sustainability. And so, we heard opinions from local residents, such as, I think they are not interested in what we really need. Many times we talk about the things we need, and I think they never report it. They don't listen to us. There was only one time they listened to us, and it was a freezer. Then we've got the broader political context of São Tomé and Príncipe itself. So in the design and implementation of projects, local authorities are very often sidelined. UNDP and the national government tend to go directly to local communities, jumping over that local government level. And this is a quote from a very senior official at UNDP saying, the Câmara of Cauê, so the local authority, is only politics. They have no money. So automatically they're not perceived as valuable partners because there's very little they can financially bring into the project. At the same time, UNDP had to deal with a lot of pressure from the national government to include over 30 communities and on top of that, national institutions in a project that was only $4 million. And that was done because the government wanted to maximize the spread of the initiative for political expediency. And UNDP could not refuse because it's just a partner to the government, and officially it was the government that led the project. So these are the internal and external factors that we identified. Now I'm going to jump into the conclusions and recommendations for the sector. In general, we believe that Ponta Baleia's resistance, it was positive on the whole in the long term. Unfortunately, it was a missed opportunity to decrease local vulnerabilities. And that also compounds climate injustice because Baleians had very little to do with causing climate change in the first place. They have very few resources to deal with its impacts in the long term. And at the same time, they missed out on adaptation assistance because of their resistance. Like I mentioned, the first stage of the project bypassed the community entirely. So that led us to conclude that technomanagerial approach to adaptation that I mentioned at the beginning is inadequate and ineffective, and we have to find different ways to promote local adaptation. And with regards to more specific recommendations for the development, we propose an overhaul of project participation models. So that can be as simple as redesigning the structure of community meetings, and for example, inviting all residents, not just some of them. Even if the project is supposed to benefit a certain group, it's always beneficial to invite everybody for just, if only to increase legitimacy at the local level. Ensuring correct timing is also important. For example, in this case, all the meetings were held in the morning, which is the least convenient time for fishermen, for farmers, for sellers, for traders, and that wasn't taken into consideration. There's a lot to be done about communication style. I was witness of some very poor tone and word choices on part of the external agents when dealing with local people. We believe that there would be some need for staff training and respectful collaboration at the local level, because there's a huge power differential between national officials and very often illiterate local residents, and that kind of has to be equalized in some way, and that can also be done through promoting self-reflection on one's own practice. And we also believe that increasing the role of local authorities and agricultural extension workers, as few as there are currently, would benefit the project because those agents, those actors have a more nuanced understanding of local issues. Taking a notch up, we propose an overhaul of the project design, implementation, and monitoring. Like I mentioned, the project couldn't change its focus because of bureaucracy, really. So there has to be more flexibility to change project design if needed. We have more space for local understandings of what vulnerability and adaptation mean to local communities, even if they go against what the projects or academics believe those concepts mean. And we need to stress quality over quantity in terms of activities. This project was stretched thin on the ground, and we need to look at long-term engagement with communities instead. One of the women residing in Ponta Baleia talked about a local group of women who make soap. It's a soap producing group. But that group has been supported for months or for multiple years by Lagos, by that same NGO. And you know, it actually requires constant support. And as the participant here said, we learned from them a bit, step by step. And perhaps the most ambitious recommendations we have is a development aid and programming reform, switching to a long-term problem or program-based approach as opposed to short, unsustainable projects. Within this recommendation, we kind of appreciate the potential of social protection programs, or what is seen as what is called adaptive social protection, as a potential way to effectively increase local adaptive capacity. And this is something that the World Bank, the World Food Program, and FAO are all looking into as of last year, because it's been noted that social protection programs have not received the due attention they deserve in increasing adaptive capacity. And then decentralization of aid, supporting local staff, not only national staff, but local staff at the local levels, making interventions accountable to people who are supposed to benefit from them, and not just donors, like in the case of the Adaptation project, which could lead to the co-production of solutions. So it's not just increasing accountability towards local people, but it's also giving them more responsibility. So here I'm talking about focusing a little bit less in terms of accountability on the World Bank in Washington DC, and more on the, for example, the Kawe district headquarters in São João de Anglares. So I think our focus is a little bit skewed right now at this moment. And finally, my final slide is on future research directions. So what we as academics can do to pursue this agenda. We need critical research on adaptation that is people-centered, not economy-centered, not GDP-centered, and so forth, and focused on local experiences, lived experience, local stories of climate change to complement that focus in development studies and practice on econometrics and technology. For that, we need evaluation methods to integrate climate justice, or at least people-centered approaches into adaptation and development interventions. So essentially, how do we do that? How do we make sure that stories like the one in Ponta Baleia don't actually happen again? And finally, to do that research, we need new methodologies that will foreground the political subjectivity of aid recipients. So how do we do research as academics to ensure that we are decolonizing research on sub-Saharan Africa or on the post-colony in general? So there's plenty of tasks ahead of us, but that just hopefully gives you an overview of the project itself and our reflections. So thank you very much, and I'm going to give it back to Tassim.
Mike, that overview, a lot of difficult and challenging issues that you've presented to us there, from social inequalities, broken promises, right through to accountability, and your critique of how aid is structured. And it's an issue that I think has been around for some time, but your perspective on some of the deep-seated challenges really brings this to life, and providing some of those recommendations is a good points for discussion. I can already see lots of questions that are coming to the fore for that.
Yeah,
but before which is fantastic, thank you very much. So keep the questions coming. We'll try and get to as many of them as I can. But what I would like to do is say thank you to Michael, but hand over to Kreska. So Kreska, like I said earlier, worked with Michael, and she's going to provide a more in-depth look at some of the gender aspects of that project that that they've been working on together. So I'd like to hand over to Kreska now, if I may. Kreska, take over, please.
I would like to use this opportunity to express that although the time I have spent studying and working at Climate Justice Center was a very short period of time, however, it was a very enjoyable period of time. Therefore, I would like to thank you, Michael, for letting me be a part of the project, and Tassin for the invitation to the webinar. I would like to quickly summarize the structure of my presentation. In my presentation, first I will talk about research rationale and aims. Later I will present research questions, then gradually discuss matters such as women's role in society, women's role in local decision-making, women's participation in local resistance, and women's role as active agents of adaptation. I will end my presentation with a short conclusion and recommendations. And later I will discuss future research needs. The starting point of my dissertation was the fact that the existing social mechanisms are not designed to address the issue of climate change effectively and sufficiently. The absence of adequate research on the ground and insufficient knowledge can jeopardize the success of adaptation projects. While many studies broadly discuss existing gender inequalities in developing countries, it is apparent that there is limited theoretical knowledge with regard to the significance of women's role in adaptation efforts and their role as active agents in this process. This project addresses this gap by uniting the theoretical frameworks of climate justice and gender justice, in which social inequalities are identified as a major obstacle in effective delivery of adaptation projects. This study focused on climate change adaptation in Ponta Baleia, where the implementation of adaptation project was met with disapproval, as Michael discussed that earlier, and resistance from local community. Specifically, the study investigated women's participation in adaptation project in Ponta Baleia and their role as active agents in this process. However, problem arise as the existing gender inequalities reduce not only women's role as participants in climate change discussion, but further undermine their potential as active agents when building adaptive capacity in the societies they are part of. Thus, in my research, it was imperative to examine and amplify a deep understanding of existing gender inequalities, particularly in small communities. Therefore, this research intended to provide answer to the following questions. I believe that it was crucial to introduce and adopt two theoretical approaches into the study: climate justice approach and gender justice approach. Geraldine Terry argues that there is no climate justice without gender justice. I also share this view, and I believe in the necessity of applying gender justice approach simultaneously with climate justice approach as a fundamental step towards gender equality, as only by combining these two approaches, justice can be achieved. Gender gaps and inequalities are very noticeable in São Tomé and can be well observed, particularly in small villages such as Ponta Baleia, where women's role in the community differs from roles partaken by men. The majority of women are heavily burdened by daily household duties. Women are accountable for maintaining the households and supervising children. They and their children are responsible for fetching water. Therefore, they walk daily to the closest rivers to sustain the household with enough water used for cooking, drinking, and washing. Although government raised a campaign to increase awareness of existing gender gaps. It is still evident that in some spheres the under-evaluation of women's role remains, as it was highlighted by this participant.
There are reprehensible situations because of the underestimation of women and abuse too. Quite often a woman is victim in the society and in the family.
This underestimation mentioned by the interviewee is predominant in the education sector, where women's prospects for better life are poorer due to limited or lack of access to it. One interviewee explained this issue as follows.
Mostly women have low level of education than men here, but it depends. There are a difference between the women of Ponta Alegre and Ponta Baleia. For Ponta Alegre, they have a high education, they studied more. Ponta Baleia is different, women there didn't study a lot.
Furthermore, very often women are excluded from decision-making processes. Although they are allowed to participate in community meetings, their overwhelming daily routines make them less likely to participate and partake in assemblies. Village is constantly represented by a male leader who is always appointed and never elected. One of the participants highlight this issue.
They don't talk much, they are shy, ashamed. So men talk more than women. They do participate, but they don't talk much.
The existing stereotypes and sometimes abusive treatment by men make women more apprehensive to share their views openly. Consequently, women rarely discuss prior matters and existing community problems.
I think it's difficult to say that women, they share the power because there are a lot of machismo things here. I think it would be a lie if I said that they do.
It is important to acknowledge that although the community was united in its resistance to the UNDP project and women participated in resistance activities equally to men, it is hard, however, to say what women's opinion about it actually were, as these opinions differ among women themselves. Some of them were in favor of UNDP project.
If we have a pig pen to put the pigs in, we can plant matabala and maniok, and the pigs wouldn't go to eat it, that food.
Others disagree strongly with this idea.
You know why people said no? Because out here everyone has farmland, and sometimes some people don't have coconut which you feed to the pigs. How can you feed them otherwise?
In case of Ponta Baleia, the community's resistance to adaptation project had the unintended result of creating an opportunity for local women to become more engaged with the adaptation project, followed the largely male-dominated leadership rejecting the solutions it had originally proposed. After the resistance occurred, the new adaptation strategies were redirected towards women in order to minimize the hardship of their daily duties. People in Ponta Baleia depend on fishing, and women are responsible for selling the catch. However, very often they are unable to trade a whole catch in one day. Therefore, to prevent the waste of unsold fish, UNDP provided a solar-powered freezer to extend product shelf life. Through this intervention, women responsible for selling fish were able to store stock and sell it on the following day, still fresh. However, to control and monitor the usage of the freezer, local women interested in this project were asked to organize an association. However, controversy arose when some women were excluded from the group, as they could not afford to pay monthly member fees.
People in community are tricky towards each other. I have no guarantee that my fish will be there, still in the freezer. And I work since the dawn in Porto Alegre, and it's so far, and I cannot control if my fish is there in the freezer. I will lose my profit on that project, so it's an interest for me.
Therefore, it is clear that women's needs differ. They are not uniform group. Therefore, it is crucial to avoid generalization. Despite difficulties faced by women in their everyday life and the constraints with the new UNDP project, women are perceived as active agents and contributors towards achieving these adaptation efforts. This is apparent mainly through the participation in local groups and associations supervised by local NGO. These activities not only provide prospects to earn additional money, but also create an opportunity for women to learn new skills. Women are more proactive and leading with numbers of local associations in Ponta Baleia. Another group formed by women and supported by a development NGO, Lagos. This cooperative is often referred as the soap group. Women involved in this association are responsible for manufacturing soap, which is later sold on a regional market or delivered to hotels. Importantly, some men intended to join the solar freezer group to benefit from the project activities. However, the women were very hesitant to cooperate with men, aware of the fragility of both autonomy and independence they recently achieved, as it was highlighted by this interviewee.
Men are interested in becoming part of the group of women's associations, but some women are not interested because if men come inside the group, they will be with the tendency to give orders to them.
During focus group discussion, it became apparent that men are disappointed that the project was directed for women only. They openly shared and expressed their frustration by highlighting and dismissing women's ability to cope with their responsibilities alone. Although women benefit greatly from the cooperation with the local NGO, gender equality has not been achieved fully. As for instance, on regional meetings, the Women's Association and the groups are still represented by one man. The importance of women's role as active agents in adaptation is often underestimated. This generalization in adaptation often decreases the potential for a project positive outcome. Seeking gender justice politically and socially requires a new approach where all gender narratives are shared and presented in such a way to reflect and conform an overreaching set of aims and values critical for gender justice. My study shows that the new societal role undertaken by women in adaptation projects positively influences changes within the community, thus gradually strengthening their position in society. This has been achieved not only by their active involvement in adaptation efforts, but rather by their ability to cooperate and govern well. However, women are still vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Their active and influential roles in reducing vulnerability and strengthening adaptive capacity are still not fully recognized. Therefore, women's contribution to adaptation efforts need to be acknowledged, and their role as active agents in adaptation should be enhanced and applied a main focus for international political practice at all scales and levels, particularly when planning, developing, and delivering new policies and strategies. Furthermore, existing gender inequalities and gender blindness reduce women's chance for a better life. Those, as presented, both climate change and climate politics have detrimental consequences on gender relations, mainly through the existence of the specific barriers analyzed in my study. Thus, I believe that for the benefit of women and the community, existing constraints must be removed to further achieve gender equality and increase the efficiency of adaptation efforts. Further research is needed for an in-depth understanding of local situations and women's role as active agents in adaptation to climate change, particularly in areas such as gender-specific adaptive capacity, a focus on gender roles in determining adaptation outcomes, policy and societal barriers to women's participation in decision-making processes, critical analysis of the leadership relationship between women's vulnerability, adaptation, and gender justice. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions, and please, if you would like to contact me, you can find my details on this slide. Thank you very much.
Kreska, listen, great, thank you very much. First of all, I recognise that there's a lot to discuss and a lot of issues that you've unpacked there, Kreska, and I'm also conscious that we're already at 4:05, so apologies for the overrunning of the presentation. But what I would like to do now is very quickly allow you, our audience, to get in on the conversation and to take part in the discussion. And I can already see that there are some comments that are online already, so I'll just mention some of those comments rather than the questions, and I'll hand over to Senan to handle the first two questions. But Tracy was mentioning the issue around social problems, increased climate vulnerability, and cannot as such be excluded from an adaptation process, and it just highlights the complexity of this matter. It's very hard to split critical issues that affect people on the ground, and there's a lot of overlap, and I can certainly see what's happening there. But also in terms of the geopolitical context, whether this is the donor-driven interests or whether projects are really in the interest of the communities that they serve. So in terms of so Bryce Bay is saying that we need to have a holistic bottom-up approach to projects, bearing in mind a political economy outlook, and certainly it's a principle I think that many people agree with. So Senan, I'd like to hand you over to the first question from Kieran, if you would like to take that question, the first two questions, and then I can take it from there. Senan, hand it over to you.
Thank you for the questions. I think this first question is from Michael, talking about the regional donor interests in adaptation. Is from Kieran. The lack of participatory planning, the rigidness of aid projects and top-down implementation hints that the vested interest and the geopolitical gains of the donor agencies is at play here. The question is, it isn't about adaptation at all, is it? So it's going to be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, Michael. There's also another question from Margaret saying that a bottom-up approach to project development has traditionally been difficult to achieve in their experience without complete support at higher level. And perhaps it's a question for Michael and Kreska to talk about how they feel support at the higher levels is necessary for development projects to be successful.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Can I interject here, Michael? Would you mind if you could keep the answers as short as possible so we can get round as many as we can? Thanks.
Sure. So the question on whether it is about adaptation at all, whether or not it's about adaptation. The question is no, it's not. And to be honest, it's not even about climate change. So paradoxically, I mean, as a climate justice researcher, I believe that despite doing research on climate justice, we very often don't actually do research that sees climate change as the main cause of people's problems. It's not. And in the case of localities such as Ponta Baleia, we can talk about the history of colonialism on the island. São Tomé has had one of the longest colonial experiences, almost 500 years in the world. So definitely, it's about the politics of our responses and not necessarily about the impact. So I definitely agree with that. And with regards to support from the higher levels, I agree that it's very important to have the support of the national government and international donors and so forth. What I'm saying is that the way it has happened, at least in Ponta Baleia, was to essentially leave to those actors to solve local problems, which was the cause of the dispute. So I think that there's a need for higher level decision makers and donors and organizations to kind of to provide that support, but also take a step back and give some leeway to local actors, even if that goes against their interests. But obviously now we're again talking about the politics and the power imbalances between different actors. So it's a very convoluted process, like I said before. But definitely I agree that local activities have to be supported by the national government in this case, for example. But the national government sometimes will not be able to do it on its own, even with UNDP.
Great, thank you, Michael, for that. I can see, well, another couple of questions also directed at you, Michael, and this one is from Liam Saddington. It's to do with ideas around about the local, how the local is understood and constructed in this context, and what does it mean, what it means to posit the resistance as local, and who is potentially included or excluded as a result. I think you'd mentioned, people that were included in consultations or not, but I wonder if you could unpack the local aspect a little bit more. And the second question comes from Christian Batts. To what extent do you think the experiences or conclusions from the case study hold true for in general? What can you generalize from the case study that you've conducted in São Tomé?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, Liam. Obviously, we make a choice when saying local resistance and who's the resistance and how local. Obviously, they're very, very important questions. Like Kreska mentioned in her presentation, some women at the community level were clearly for building pigsties because they saw their crops being eaten by free roaming livestock. So in that sense, definitely, presenting it as local resistance is problematic. But when I say local, I mean the local community level, and I say that with the reservation that communities obviously are not uniform. But because of the language that the development sector uses, we went with, rather than individual resistance or household resistance, we went with local resistance or community resistance. In terms of what's generalizable, I think surprisingly a lot. Even though São Tomé Príncipe is a very specific place, in my experience working with UNDP, I was an adaptation intern in the regional office in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. The employees of that office said that adaptation projects across the country don't really differ that much from one another. They were directly talking to me about the cookie cutter approach, copying and pasting activities from one project to the other. It's not stuff that is really discussed, during meetings, official meetings, but that is what is happening. So I think that we can generalize a lot, especially when it comes to how you talk to and how you deal with local people, how you show them or don't show them respect, and to what extent you understand their local challenges. I think there's plenty to do and to address in this context, not just in São Tomé Príncipe, but in sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. I mean, I think the development sector has very similar ailments regardless of the country, and in that sense, that kind of makes it a little bit more. I think it's more optimistic because it's not just that the lessons that we have learned from this project are only applicable to that village. They're not. They're definitely generalizable to more places.
Great, Michael, thanks for sending in. Just looking at a couple of comments. There's one here from Stephen Webb who talks about neoliberalism loves resilience, and that there's a growing sociological literature criticising the link between neoliberalism and resilience. And his suggestion is interesting, that we replace resilience with endurance as a more viable political concept. That's an interesting one, Stephen. Thank you for that. And he's provided a couple of links there to some references. So, Senan, over to you with a question from Lena.
So, question from Lena. I'm worried about adaptation will end up meaning that donors will forget about prevention and the eradication of these socio and economic and political practices that maintain fossil fuel-based lifestyles that will perpetuate climate change. The question is, will the transformational work to change social relations, where will the transformational work to change social relations come in? And another question from Russell Jones. Do you think this concept of endurance rather than resilience also applies in the UK? And they comment that the work we've done on the individual and community resilience includes transformation, not just endurance or bouncing back as a result of the crisis. I think it was going to be interesting to hear from both Michael and Kreska what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. No, Kreska, sorry, I've been monopolizing the responses. If you have anything to add to what I've just said about the other ones.
I'm just afraid that you will hear the sound in the background. That's why I would just let you answer the question.
No worries. Well, if there's anything, just let us know.
I will let you know.
With regards to the neoliberalism and resilience, I completely agree, Stephen. I think resilience is in my opinion, a very dangerous concept and a very detrimental concept. And you can look at my profile. I've recently published a paper on that, a couple of papers on resilience and how it actually doesn't help the way it is understood. Whether or not endurance would change the situation, I'm not sure, because development organizations have the notorious capacity to hijack very, very progressive terms. Social capital used to be a very progressive term. Now it's not. Sustainability, same thing. So, for example, at the Climate Justice Center, we're hoping they're not going to do it to climate justice. I'm not sure if framing it as endurance versus resilience will change much, hopefully, but honestly, I haven't heard of endurance as an alternative, so that's very interesting. In terms of transformation, transformative adaptation, there is some research talking about transformative adaptation. Karen O'Brien from I think the University of Oslo, if I'm not mistaken, and her colleagues. And the main finding, the way I understand it, of transformative adaptation research is that it's not really, again, about adaptation. It's about transforming our social relations and our systems of production and consumption, which has, in a way, a lot to do with climate change, but it goes way beyond just the problematization of climate change as such. It's not the CO2 that's the problem. It's what leads to CO2 emissions. So I would definitely agree with that. Not sure that answers your question. And for the UK context, I don't specialize in resilience or endurance in the UK, so I wouldn't have too much to say on that. But what I think one of the biggest differences would be here is that the way we relate to research beneficiaries or participants in the UK is usually different, a little different than in post-colonial states, especially if it's Western academics who conduct research, or Western practitioners, or as they like to call themselves, expats. So I'm not sure beyond what the differences would be, but I would have to give it some more thought.
Great, Michael, thanks very much. I'm going to have to keep you speaking a little bit longer. Another question from Liam. How do you distinguish between local and indigenous? And another question from Stephen Kansuk regarding adaptation initiatives are almost the same across communities. Do you think that they're you may find similar overlaps in countries such as Ghana.
Local versus indigenous. You're setting me up for failure here, Liam, because there's a whole literature on that, I think. But the way I understand indigeneity is a bit more specific than local. So I would say that from my perspective, my limited, and I don't specialize in indigenous studies. I have to make that a disclaimer. Indigeneity is more specific than localness or locality. So obviously, indigenous is part of the local, but local doesn't have to be indigenous. I haven't worked with indigenous communities, and I would consider people in Ponta Baleia not to be indigenous. Well, because São Tomé Príncipe did not have an indigenous population before colonization, interestingly. So everybody who was there was brought as either as slaves or indentured workers from elsewhere in Africa. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that's not satisfying to you as an answer, but maybe we can pick it up individually. And what was the other question? Sorry.
The question from Stephen about whether you would consider finding similar issues in countries such as Ghana as you have found in São Tomé.
I'm not familiar with the Ghanaian context, but I believe it would be very similar. Not only because it's a similar region of the continent, similar region of Africa, but also because of the similarity of actors who do development there. Like if my experience at the regional center in Ethiopia is of any indication, my guess is that adaptation projects by UNDP in Ghana will be very similar in their structure and outputs, outcomes, and objectives to the one in São Tomé Príncipe. So I think there would be definitely overlaps there. But you would have to conduct, I guess, a comparative study on that. Happy to do it.
Thanks, Michael, for that. And I think, Sarah, we've only got another couple of questions, and I'm looking at the time, so these are probably the last two questions, if we could squeeze them in.
Certainly. There's a comment by Lena, which says, I think the bouncing back is part of the conceptual problem. So there's bouncing back from crisis, and that it locks women into constant inequality and abuse. And I wondered if Kreska had some thoughts on that comment. And this is perhaps a question from Michael, also from Lena, but the way multinational corporations meet human needs needs looking at, that perhaps this looking for profit-making opportunities is at the heart of the problem. If you had any comments or responses to those comments.
Well, see, you guys are all on the same page with me, so this is not very interesting, but but definitely I agree with Lena that bouncing back is a problematic concept, because if you're bouncing back to oppression, that doesn't help the person, right? So that's one of the arguments against resilience. Conceptually, resilience is a very conservative concept. You're supposed to, according to resilience, you're supposed to preserve the current state and kind of climate proof it in the context of climate change impacts. So that's why we're talking about transformation, or at least reform. But resilience is not very ambitious as a concept to begin with. And yeah, I mean, multinational corporations will try to get in on the adaptation bandwagon. There's, like I said, there's a lot of money in play here, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. And that's already happening during the Copenhagen summit in 2009. So that was a while ago. There was a mini summit of technological solutions to climate change, and guess who was there? Shell, ExxonMobil, and so forth. So definitely there's an encroachment of multinational corporations into this arena, and unfortunately I don't think that's easy to prevent. They're very powerful actors, obviously, but I wouldn't see them as key for making people more prepared. But that's just my opinion.
Okay, Chris, could you have any final words?
Excuse me, Tessina, I'm really sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Do you have any final words on any of the gender aspects?
I believe that the most important issue is, and I think that this is something which should be always highlighted, is the fact that we should do everything we can to avoid that generalization, to look at women's issue from completely through the lens of from a different side, and not to jump to the conclusions, and be more open to all the ideas which come from a bottom-up approach.
Great, Kreska, thanks very much. So, so just before we go on to the closing session, just another quick comment from Lena that she agrees with what you were saying, Michael. We need transformative change that tackles neoliberal degradation of the environment and oppression of many diverse groups. That's a fantastic comment to end on. Yeah, so it's just, I see that we've got 5 minutes of time left, and just by way of close, I just want to say a few points to say that quite a few have been asking about Michael and Kreska's final report. The final report on the project will be available by the end of next week. And if you would like a copy of that, then please do get in touch. And what we hope to do, certainly the team, is to expand this project to include other case studies and to see if we can identify on a wider scale and dig deep into the issues that have already been unpacked by this study. So, you know, if there are opportunities to do so, if you'd like to work in partnership with us to do so, then also please do get in touch with us for that. We will also be administering a short survey at the end of this event just to get feedback on the session, but also to invite you to join our mailing list. It will be fantastic if you can do that. Our full public engagement calendar is now available, so you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. You can see there we've got quite a busy schedule over the summer right up until the end of September, and if you are able to join us for that, then any of those sessions, please do so. But what I want to do is say a huge thank you to you, our audience, for joining us for this event today. I understand the conditions of lockdown is not easy for everyone, but I'm delighted that you are able to connect with us, and hope you can do so again. But also a huge thanks to our presenters, Michael and Kreska. You did a fantastic job. It's challenging presenting in front of an audience that you can't see and interact with, but I think you both did really well and handled all the questions admirably, so well done you. But we sincerely, all of us at the Centre for Climate Justice, look forward to welcoming you to our next public engagement, which is on microfinance and climate change adaptation, which will be held on the 1st of July. And Michael, again, will be presenting at that, but also with our colleagues, Dr. Karen Helvig, also from the Centre for Climate Justice, but and we will be joined by Pete Parisetti from Opportunity International UK. So we look forward to that immensely. But all it remains for me to say is a huge thank you, and goodbye, and hope to see you and connect with you again soon. Thanks.
Yeah, thank
Bye,
you guys.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Kreska.
Thank you very much.